Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Ngozi Lawal from the Center for the Study of Social Policy and really delighted to have you join us on this last conversation of our summer webinar series. Today's topic is increasing business investments in early care and education, and particularly looking at leveraging state and local chambers of commerce. This discussion is supported by the National Collaborative of Infants and Toddlers, which is a project of the Pritzker Family Foundation. Today we're joined by Julia Barfield. She's the Senior Manager of Policy and Programs at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation. We're also joined by Amy Anderson, who's the Government Affairs Director of Education, Workforce, Healthcare, and Federal Issues at the Association of Washington Business, and Michelle Beeler, the Human Resources Director at Schweitzer Engineering Laboratories, Incorporated. So each of our participants will be sharing information with you to help you think about effective strategies for advancing the mutual interests of business and the child care sectors and increasing early care and education investments. Before we begin, we just have a few housekeeping items before turning it over to our presenters. So first, all of your lines have been muted, but we don't want that to stop you from sharing your questions and thoughts and reflections that come up for you as you listen to the information that's being presented. We've muted you because we just want to keep the background noise to a minimum. At any point during the webinar, we encourage you to use the chat box function. You can find it on the right panel of your screen. And you use that box to submit your questions and any thoughts that come to mind. And we will read those out when we get to the Q&A portion of the discussion. You may also just use the raise your hand function, which is also in that right panel. And at the end of the presentation, we will acknowledge you, unmute you, so that you can have the ability to talk directly to the presenters. So those are the two ways in which you'll be able to interact with our presenters today. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Julia Barfield to begin. Julia?
Thank you, Ngozi. We are thrilled to be speaking on this webinar today and to be partnering with CSSP, so thank you for hosting us. This is going to be a very short and sweet overview of several years of work that the Chamber Foundation has done in early childhood education, and that has been a result of a lot of investment from many members of our team. So if you have any questions about the content that we'll be sharing today, feel free to reach out to me directly because I'd love to follow up and continue the conversation. So to jump right in, at the Chamber Foundation, we see early childhood education as a two-generation workforce challenge. We must improve and expand access to childcare for working parents who are our workforce of today, and we must lay a strong foundation for young children who are our future workforce. This is the perspective and kind of how we approach all of our work in early childhood education. So we have spent several years educating and mobilizing state and local chambers on the business case for high quality early childhood education, and we will continue to do that work because we're committed to being a resource for the business community. During that time, we've had countless conversations with state and local chambers and with employers directly who are bought into the importance of early childhood education as a workforce issue, but are unsure of where to start or not clear about their next steps. At the same time, we've also had countless conversations with early education folks who have sought our insight or thought that we had some special trick or key to engaging the business community. So, spoiler alert, there isn't one secret to engaging your state or local chamber. We are working really hard to provide tools and resources and share our expertise widely. But at the end of the day, you and your organization are the ones who are responsible for partnering with state and local chambers in your community. So I don't live or work in your community, so I can't tell you the best answer for your context. But what I can tell you is how we've approached this conversation with state and local chambers and equip you with some tools on how you might adapt your approach as well. Additionally, the next two speakers are incredible women who are experts in their fields, and so they will be able to help share their perspective and shed some light on how they came to this conversation and what their approach has been. So at the Chamber Foundation, our perspective and why we care about this issue is because we believe that childcare is a crucial economic driver. We believe that high quality, affordable, accessible early childhood education ensures a strong workforce, which leads to strong businesses and which creates a strong economy. So when you're thinking about engaging business leaders, it's often easy to forget that we serve vastly different purposes. And that doesn't mean that we can't come together and be very effective in our joint efforts. It does mean, though, that when you're trying to engage business leaders, they aren't necessarily in the conversation for all the same reasons that you are. And that's okay. Nevertheless, we believe that there are many reasons that we're all coming to this conversation that are overlapping and that there is common ground. But at the same time, we can't lose sight of our different purposes within the community. We also see at the Chamber Foundation, those different roles can often cause challenges and friction, but we see them as an opportunity to create stronger partnerships and more lasting change. So when we start talking to state and local chambers, we begin from the perspective of our workforce of today. We start by addressing the challenges that businesses are feeling every single day and that they know firsthand. So Tom Donahue, the president and CEO of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, says oftentimes that there are jobs without people and people without jobs. And we know that because 40% of businesses today can't take on new work because of their inability to find or retain skilled labor. So with this trend continuing, we will have 6 million unfilled jobs by 2020. And we will continue to see this number increase with the way that technology is disrupting how we do business. So at the Chamber Foundation, we see childcare as a key piece of recruiting and retaining skilled workers. And when we talk about early childhood education as a two-generation workforce issue, we start with the current workforce because one of the top priorities for state and local chambers is the economic stability of their city, state, or region. So therefore, this challenge of finding and recruiting a skilled workforce is a front and center concern for state and local chambers. And whether or not they've identified childcare as one of the crucial pieces to solving that puzzle of their workforce challenges, this issue impacts them directly. And the same goes directly for employers. They see their bottom line today, and those impacts can be felt. We also know that the workforce looks different than it did 10 or 20 years ago, and businesses need to understand the changing demographics of their workforce in order to design solutions to meet their workforce challenges. And like I said earlier, those challenges can be quantified and felt by business of any size, sector, or region, because businesses lose over $3 billion annually due to breakdowns in childcare. And as I'm sure you already know, there are about 12 million children in paid out-of-home care. So those breakdowns are impacting millions of children and their parents. And we also know that 2/3 of women with children under the age of 5 work outside the home. Furthermore, 8 out of every 10 births today are to millennials, who make up 1/3 of our workforce. So I share this data not to say that this is a women's issue or a millennial issue, because we believe it's a workforce issue and an economic issue, but we do highlight the changing demographics for business leaders to show how this issue intersects with other subgroups. So once we cover the workforce of today, we also move on to the workforce of tomorrow. And we will briefly give an overview of the workforce of tomorrow, because oftentimes when we're having these conversations, we have someone who's steeped in the brain science to talk about what's happening developmentally in the first 5 years of life. But what you may or may not know is that many state and local chambers have been involved already in school boards, school governance, accountability, and assessments. And so for many chambers, this is a comfortable space. And I often show this graph to chambers during presentations because it indicates a lot of the impact of their time and investments in the K-12 system. This data that shows our increases in investment since 1964 and 12th grade NAEP scores remaining pretty stagnant is often pretty compelling, because we also pair it with talking about the high ROI of the first 5 years of life. So that's not to say that investing in the K-12 system isn't worthwhile, but it's a challenge to state and local chambers to think about where they're already comfortable in the education space and saying, are their investments really being made at the most important times of our life? And are we really laying the strongest foundation for our kids to be successful in the future? We also talk about the changing skills in our labor market, because this really resonates with businesses in the short term and the immediate term, because they see how the way that they're doing business has changed dramatically, even from a couple years ago. And so we show them this graph to show, look, we are going to be requiring more and more of social skills, your executive function skills, your teamwork, your resilience, your perseverance, all of those social skills and that social emotional development that you all know happens in early childhood programs and in the first 5 years of life. Those are the skills that our businesses are going to be dependent on. So as we increase automation and routine tasks decrease, the needs of our labor market are going to look differently. And so if we're really going to set our future workforce up for success, we need to think about a future that we're preparing for children that we don't actually know what it looks like. So where we've been so far, we have spent several years taking on the challenge of educating business leaders. I think the national dialogue has changed dramatically from when we started, but we created the Workforce of Today, Workforce of Tomorrow report to talk about the business case for early child education. That message really resonated with a lot of people, and it helped them put, their finger on, I've been feeling this challenge, but I didn't really know kind of what it was or how to approach it. So as a follow-up to that report, we created a Leading the Way toolkit, which is a very beginning step to help businesses understand, hey, what are my options? On-site childcare is not the only option for people, and for many, it's not feasible. You're going to hear from Michelle, who's incredible and committed to this work, but we know that for many businesses, on-site care isn't their only option. And so we want them to look at their menu of choices, and it is a challenging field to navigate, but we want to help you kind of navigate those together. So that's where we've been. Where we're going is a result of the time we've spent talking to business leaders and talking with early education folks. So we will continue to educate business leaders. We think that's an important role of ours. But to build on that, we want to help bridge this divide that we continue to see, because ultimately, we're not asking businesses to get into the business of childcare, right? We are asking them to understand how early child education impacts them and their workforce. So a few messages and things that we're asking the business community is we're encouraging them to assess the unique needs of their workforce. We want them to understand, what are your employees doing for childcare? Are you in multiple locations? Because whatever solution you have has to work for your headquarters staff or people who are working non-traditional hours or hourly wage employees. This is really a crucial step for businesses to then begin to think through their solutions. The next thing is we want them to understand their context. We want them to understand that there is a system that already exists around them, and that's you. So that system might be flawed, it might be underfunded, it might be, in stress, but there is a system of providers, of advocates, of educators who are working really hard and have been in the field for much longer than them. And so we want them to see that they don't have to reinvent the wheel, and there are people who can help them along the way to navigate this field. And that's where you play such a crucial step as helping to let them understand, this is a complicated field, right? We have access, affordability, quality challenges, and that's really hard to solve, but they don't have to solve that alone. At the same time, we're asking you, the early education community, to focus on shared goals. I think oftentimes we have heard from people who have been in this field for 10, 20, 30 years, and there has been a lot of frustration with the business community to say either they have nominally engaged or they haven't engaged at all, and those frustrations and resentments are so valid and understandable. But the national dialogue, again, is shifting, and I think there are more and more people who are interested and engaged in this conversation than you might realize. And so if you can focus on the shared goals and see the forest through the trees and think about, what are the outcomes that we're going for? Maybe we don't necessarily agree on how to get there, but can we at least agree on what are the outcomes? We are also asking you to understand the employer's needs. Again, because you are the experts in this field, it might be really important for you to ask employers what they need, because they don't understand reimbursement rates, they don't understand QRS systems, but you do, and that's your area of expertise. And so can you help understand employers' needs to then find solutions that are going to work for you and work for them? And then our third ask ultimately is for thoughtful and sustainable partnerships. And again, the next two speakers are going to do an excellent job of showing you what that looks like, knowing that it's hard work. But for business leaders, we're asking for partnership that means that they lean on the expertise of you in the field. And for the early ed folks, we want you to see business leaders not just as a conduit to policymakers, but as partners to engage from the beginning not just to ask them to sign on to your policy priorities without their input or innovation. So a quick sneak peek, and I'm just going to breeze through this because I'm running behind time, but we are creating a messaging guide. We're really excited about this messaging guide, and we have done a lot of listening over the past several years that led to the creation of this guide. We will dive into it later, but we're releasing it in this late fall, and I'll be sure to share it with CSSP so that they can spread it widely. But we listen to business leaders and early education advocates in both a quantitative survey and qualitative focus groups. So the biggest areas of caution that we found that we thought might be of interest to you is that employers and state and local chambers were really hesitant to avoid blaming the employees. Oftentimes our arguments for early child education talk about absenteeism, low productivity, but instead they wanted to shift it to what are the positive benefits rather than the negative benefits. So do you increase recruitment rates? Can you retain workers more? That resonated better with them. Additionally, we wanted to focus on tailored messaging. So again, understanding where business leaders are in their comprehension of this very complex field. You know, you can't talk to them as if they understand all of the nuances of the conversation. And so we really want you to think about, you know, how do you engage parents in your programs? Or if you have a history of working in an early childhood program, how would you engage a parent whose skills you want to improve on, right? You wouldn't go about shaming them or talking about the complexity of different theories. You would approach them where they are in their level of understanding. And you aren't necessarily condoning their level of parenting or how they're going about it, but you're trying to draw on their strengths and say, you understand X, Y, or Z, and therefore I'm going to come alongside you and help you become a better parent. We want you to do the same thing for businesses, to understand their level of engagement and understanding of the topic and come alongside them and raise that awareness level and their knowledge base. Along the same vein, we want you to simplify the messages. We have heard from numerous state and local chambers that they will have a meeting with an early education group or coalition and they leave there overwhelmed simply because you know that the challenges of this field are real, right? They are complex and there are numerous funding streams that intersect and overlap, but it's really complicated. And so these messages we're hoping to tailor and simplify to get you in the door. That doesn't mean you have to change your coalition's ask. It doesn't mean that you have to change, you know, your authentic approach to the conversation. It just means in order to get in the door, we have to simplify the messages. We had a few key insights that I want to share with you. State and local chambers were really interested in the difference between high and low resource areas and not necessarily thinking about the differences between urban and rural areas. So there might be a rural area with one major employer, and that was considered a high resource area. So when thinking about how to tailor their message and understanding employer needs, we thought it was really interesting to hear the differences between high versus low resource areas. Again, I had talked about, you know, avoiding blaming. In that same vein, when we talked about recruitment and retention, those messages resonated much better than productivity rates or absenteeism rates. And then ultimately, lexicon is complicated. And you know this to be true, so I'm preaching to the choir, but in this field, we have a lot of different terms. And that can oftentimes be incredibly overwhelming and confusing for state and local chambers and business leaders. And so we're going to talk much more about this in the messaging guide, but just being cognizant of the way that we use words and phrases and nuances in the field can really make or break engagement with state and local chambers. So I'm going to turn it over to the next two speakers who are doing great work, and feel free to connect with me in the future if you have questions. And thank you very much.
All right. Hello, everyone. This is Amy Anderson, Association of Washington Business. We are the state's Chamber of Commerce, as well as Manufacturing Association designated by NAM. And the biggest question that we always get asked is, why are we even involved in this area? And basically what Julia said is that childcare, early childhood learning is a two-generation workforce issue. One of the biggest struggles we've had is really that education and awareness aspect of making sure that our employers, our business leaders really do have a deep understanding of this issue. It really came to Washington State when the Center for American Progress released their Child Care Desert Survey, and Washington State was in the top area of more than 60% of our residents are living in a child care desert across the state. So how do we then start to address those issues? Because we do have a very condensed population area in our Puget Sound region around Seattle. However, the majority of our state is rural. There's a lot of agriculture. So addressing the child care and early childhood learning issue on a multiple levels based on our demographics, as well as our industry mix throughout the state. One of the things that we started to do in our 2018 legislative session, we had some very big child care advocates amongst our elected officials, is they passed a piece of legislation that put into statute the Child Care Collaborative Task Force. Sorry about that. There we go. Yep. So that needs to go back. There we go. Sorry about that. The Child Care Collaborative Task Force, as you can see here, put into statute in 2018. This year we were able to increase our awareness with our state legislators in educating them about this issue, so they expanded it in this legislative session. The goal of this is to develop policies and recommendations to incentivize employer participation in the child care discussion. So the conversation was, we have a lot of child care issues hitting hitting Washington State. It's in fact impacting our economy. We have a labor shortage across the state in all industries, and this is one piece of that puzzle that we need to solve, including improving that child care access and affordability. The first round of recommendations is due to the governor and legislature this November. So the task force, which I'm a part of, as well as Michelle, who you'll hear from in a few minutes, has been working on this for about the last 18 months to come to a set of policy recommendations addressing this issue. We have 12 voting members on the task force, including providers, business, and labor, but we have almost 30 folks in the room who are part of this discussion and have been committed over the last 18 months. We have providers, we have community organizations whose focus is on childcare and early learning. We have legislators as well as local elected officials and other chambers of commerce, local and regional chambers of commerce across the state. Once you get the slides, I believe they're going to be available to all participants. You can click on the Staff by Washington State Department of Commerce, and that does lead to the web page for the Child Care Collaborative Task Force. But again, what I'd like to reiterate on this effort is there was an education and awareness issue in Washington State where we had a study that showed we were a big child care desert state, but the stakeholders needed to come to the table to have a collaborative conversation about how we address this. Our businesses, our labor, our elected officials, our community organizations really had an awareness issue that we needed to address. So over the last 18 months, as we've been developing a policy agenda, we also have been developing that education aspect of why is this an issue that Washington State businesses and industries really do need to pay attention to. As a Chamber of Commerce, we had that question asked of us by our board members as well as our other members across the state. And explaining it again, as Julia did, we're dealing with a labor shortage currently that's being exacerbated by a lack of affordable and available childcare. Our businesses are losing their employees, particularly after that first child, when it gets into the point. A good example, actually, in Seattle, it's not unheard of for a couple to be spending between $30,000 to $50,000 a year on childcare for 2 toddlers. That becomes an economic issue within the family of, is it of value to have a parent stay home or in the workforce? So recognizing that those issues were hitting our businesses, we conducted a study on economic impact of the lack of accessible and affordable childcare and the costs on parents, employers in Washington State. The U.S. Chamber, Washington State Department of Commerce, Association of Washington Business and Child Care Aware all participated in funding the study and really looking at what is the economic impact to Washington State because we are in this situation of a lack of child care. So some of the preliminary key findings, we're going to be releasing the study here in about 3 weeks, are that 49% of Washington parents found it difficult or very difficult to find and afford and keep child care. 27% quit their job or left school or training due to child care issues. And as you can see there, 10% were fired or let go due to child care issues. This resulted in a $2.1 billion estimated direct cost, not only to our industry, but to the state of Washington, of turnover due to child care issues, with a $3.7 billion estimated lost opportunity cost of turnover. So in other words, you have folks who are leaving the workforce or putting off and re-entry into the workforce or delaying training programs because they do not have access to affordable or quality child care in their area. We do have a couple follow-up studies coming up. The state of Washington is doing a state employee survey, so they'll be reaching out to all employees in the state of Washington, asking some of these same questions. As far as, have they lost time? Have they delayed any types of promotions, et cetera, because of a lack of quality, affordable child care? And we're looking at how do we reach out to our child care providers currently and find out where they are. Are they planning on continuing to provide care? Do they have plans to shut down? Or are they in the process of losing a lot of their staffing? And the reason we're doing this, and this is specific to Washington State, I say that knowing that other states are dealing with some of these same issues. In addition to the regulations impacting our child care providers, they are small businesses. So we have put in place in the state of Washington regulations that will impact all small businesses, which is capturing our child care providers as well, such as an increased minimum wage, paid family leave. We have predictive scheduling coming our way. A lot of these employment issues that are impacting all industries have that multiplying effect on our child care providers because of the heavily regulated child care industry, and then adding on to that those regulations that are impacting some of our small businesses or our businesses across the state. And the reason we're reaching out to do this survey is because we have heard from providers across the state that they are planning on shutting down, or they're losing providers because we have in the state of Washington increased regulations around credentialing and certification of providers to the extent that we're headed in the direction of looking at bachelor's degree requirements for child care providers. So that's something internally, but as you look at what your states are doing, being thoughtful about how you increase quality while at the same time addressing the affordability and the accessibility issue is key. Our concern is that as you increase the credentialing and certification requirements, which is getting to quality, which is important, you are exacerbating the accessibility and affordability issue at the same time. So those are some of the key issues that we're dealing with in Washington State from a regulatory perspective. Moving forward, some of the other findings from the study that we've conducted is that over 3/4 of the respondents had sought or used child care. Nearly half of them found it difficult or very difficult to keep or find that. So 49%, there were no openings near their home or work. 36% said that available care does not accommodate their work hours. In a heavy manufacturing state, as Washington State is, as many others are across the country, you have lines running 24/7. So finding childcare that will accommodate overnight shifts or late evening, early morning, or even weekend shifts becomes extremely difficult. And then, of course, too many of our folks are finding that the childcare near them is not of good quality, or it is too far away from their home or work. The state child care subsidy is another issue that Washington State is facing, and due to the fact that we have not addressed the level of subsidy. Currently, Washington State's subsidy is about 27% of what the actual cost of child care is. So if a child care provider is providing care and taking child or state subsidy parents, they have to have a pretty high mix of private pay versus the state pay in order to even be able to accommodate that. We have been trying to educate our legislators on an understanding of how that can be detrimental to the workforce issue, and getting people back into work and continuing their training. The other piece to that is that we do have a cliff. So basically, we've heard from folks who, if they accept maybe a $250 bonus at Christmas or a 50-cent to $1 an hour raise, that puts them over the limit of receiving that child care subsidy, and they are immediately cut off. We had one example about a month ago of a woman who was paying $480 a month in child care. The next day, because she had accepted a raise, and it was a $1.50 an hour raise, she was going to be paying over $1,800 a month. And that doesn't equate. So that's something we have to, regulatory-wise as well, really look at what our rules are concerning our child care providers. Some other key findings, and this goes to folks leaving the workforce, delaying reentry into the workforce, and/or training programs. You can see some of those findings there. Some of our parents have gone from full-time to part-time. The example that I used is Seattle, where you have a couple paying over $50,000 for 2 children in child care. Economically, it doesn't necessarily equate in the immediate time. But of course, as you look out to the future, that has then curtailed somebody's career as well as their increased earning activity over time. That goes to the decline in career educational opportunity as well, or if they've had to quit their job and/or training programs. So just as a wrap up before I turn it over to Michelle, really pulling together a diverse stakeholder population to have this discussion is key to moving the conversations forward, because you probably do have an education and awareness aspect that needs to be addressed. People need to understand that this is an issue. We found that some of our upper level management or C-level, when we asked them to go back to their companies and ask their HR folks about this issue, they came back to us and said, yep, you're right, this is an issue, we had no idea. Because we do this internally in businesses. We take care of each other and we take care of the situation. But what that's bleeding into is we have a lack of support for our parents in the workforce to allow them to continue their careers, enter into careers, and expand their earning potential. So just my guidance from our experience here in Washington State is to have that diversity of stakeholders at the table as you go through and work through some of these questions. So I'll turn that over to Michelle.
Great. Thank you, Amy. So my name is Michelle Beeler. I work at Schweitzer Engineering Laboratories. And we have been a partner with Amy's organization, AWB, for well over a decade, partnering in many different aspects of business. And within the last couple of years, we've specifically been sharing our story around some of our benefits that we've been providing to our employees, one of them being corporate childcare. And I think to really understand our involvement now at the state and larger level, it's important to understand our story. So I wanted to start with that today and walk through why we have entered as an employer into this conversation and this industry. So we are located in Pullman, Washington. That's our headquarters. We have 5,200 employees around the world. About 4,000 of those in the United States. 2,600 of them are in our headquarters in Pullman, Washington. And then we have employees in 52 other offices around the United States. Our vision is to make electrical power safer, more reliable, and more economical. We were founded over 35 years ago by Dr. Schweitzer, who was originally a professor. So education is core to our innovation and how we keep building our business. That doesn't really explain why we got into childcare. As we've grown and our headquarters have grown, we started to see an increasing need in finding resources within our small rural community of Pullman, Washington for our employees. We were moving folks into our community. They were unable to find childcare, unable to find quality childcare, and the childcare lists were growing. We are both an engineering firm and a manufacturing facility, so we have a diverse population of employees that have very different needs. Our manufacturing employees, our day shift starts at 6 a.m., and they were having a very difficult time finding any childcare facility that was even open at that hour. When I began looking into this problem, I started researching how often this had come up, and I found the first on-site childcare proposal was over 20 years old. I found documentation of that. So it had been a conversation in our company for a long time. We are 100% employee owned, and with that, we're dedicated to meeting our employees' needs and using our employee dollars to help meet those needs. So we decided to actually enter into the business of childcare and put an on-site childcare facility in our headquarters. Our facility holds over 131 children. It has extended hours. It opens at 6 a.m. and closes at 7 p.m. It's only closed on SEL holidays. We also provide transportation to the local school districts. We provide additional infant amenities, so we provide diapers and formula for all of our infants. Also, we provide fresh on-site meals for all of our non-infants that are made in our on-site kitchen. We have a holistic curriculum so that if you have multiple kids in our center, they're all talking about the same things at the dinner table. And then, of course, one of the best benefits is that it's located on campus. You can see some pictures here that you'll often see these strollers walking around the streets of our campus, which always brings a smile to my face. Within a year of opening our facility in 2015, we were full. Our center was 100% full, and we now have an extensive waiting list. So at the beginning, the strengths that we were seeing from our center was increased recruiting, increased retention. We saw the percentage of mothers returning to work almost double. It created a long-term dedication from our employees and trust. We were not only looking after them as an employee, but also their family. As that has grown, we've noticed that we can't meet the needs of our entire population anymore because our population keeps growing. Our capacity is an issue. We have over 80 kids on our wait list right now, and the cost of care is still an issue. It's extremely high. We are subsidizing our on-site childcare facility well over $500,000. It's money well spent because we've seen it in our recruiting and retention numbers, but it's not sustainable. So at that point in time, it was really when we decided we needed to get involved at a bigger level than just our organization in our headquarters. And I feel like a lot of companies are very much siloed in their thoughts. They want to solve the problem for them, which is what we do as business owners every day. We've solved problems for our employees and for our companies. But going through that process, we really started to realize we couldn't solve it for everyone. In addition, we had employees in 52 other sites that were also experiencing the same problem. So we've put in place some national programs, some national discounts to help our employees. But we really needed to start to get involved at a state and potentially federal level, share our story and share how this is impacting employers across the nation. Our founder, one of his favorite sayings is the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And that's really what we're doing in every part of our business, but especially in our innovation with our benefits. So not only do we know that we want to provide those on-site to our employees, but we want to partner with others around the state to help make those benefits available to everyone. No matter where they're located, because we can't build a childcare facility in every place that we have employees. It's just impossible. So that's really why we began being more involved with AWB. why we wanted to join the task force and share our story and share an employer's perspective. I think it's really important for any employers or for agencies that are working with employers to recognize employers need to know their population and what their population's needs are, and that's going to be different across the board. And employers aren't going to be able to do the same things. So having flexibility in how offerings are provided is really, really important. If you want to learn more about our programs, you can go to our website at seattleFamilyCenter.com, talk specifically about a lot of our on-site benefits, or you're more than welcome to reach out to me directly. And I think with that, turn it back over to Julia.
Okay, so I think we're going to take questions now. So CSSP, let me know if that's how to go about doing that.
No, that's great. We'll jump right into questions, but first we want to thank all of you for your wonderful presentation. We've got a couple of questions that have come into the chat function, the chat box, so I'll just begin reading those, and then if you're participating and have questions that just came to you and you'd like to have those read, go ahead and type them into the chat box, or use the raise your hand function and we'll unmute you and you can talk directly to the presenters. So the first question that we have here is, when you refer to chambers, and Julia, this might be targeted more towards you, but I think any of you could address it. So when you refer to chambers, are you speaking of those representing primarily urban communities and mainstream organizations, or have you built partnerships with chambers in rural areas and those which represent specific cultural communities?
Yeah, so I would, that's a great question, and the chamber world is complicated, so I acknowledge that. I didn't want to spend too much time diving into the U.S. Chamber, but we are the association basically for state and local chambers across the country. So if you can believe it, there are about as many chambers as there are school districts in this country, and that means that they're in urban, rural communities. They are focused on specific industries. They're focused on different racial economic groups. But not all of them are members of the U.S. Chamber, but we work with all of them. And so the U.S. Chamber really serves the needs of chambers across the country, and trade associations like Amy said, Association of Washington Business doesn't have the word chamber in it, but they are their state chambers. So it is complicated, but I would say that when I'm saying state and local chambers, that's kind of a catch-all phrase for anything and everything for chamber world.
And this is Amy. The membership on our Child Care Collaborative Task Force includes not only us as the State Chamber of Commerce, but we have one of our major regional chambers of commerce from Spokane serves on that, as well as our Grace Harbor Community Chamber, which is a small rural area on the peninsula of Washington State. And then we have the executive director from the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce in the Tri-Cities area, which is the south, kind of the middle south part of the state. And that's been extremely helpful to have those different economies represented at the task force as well. And then what AWB has, it's called a Grassroots Alliance, which is a group of about, I think it's 87 local and regional chambers of commerce that we work with on our issues. And this has certainly been one issue that they've been extremely active on, because it is very important, particularly if you have a diverse economy or diverse economies and populations in your state, to have a good understanding of what's taking place in the different regions. Because while in the Seattle region you might have folks, it's less of an affordability issue, more of an access issue. On the peninsula in Washington State, it's both affordable and accessible. And in other parts of the state, it's just that there's nothing there. The affordability is not the issue, it's the accessibility issue. So just having the diverse stakeholders at the table, as I said before, is extremely important.
Great, thank you. So another question reads, how were the $2.1 billion and $3.7 billion calculated? So Amy, I think that question is for you. You had a slide that spoke to the economic impact of the lack of accessible and affordable child care costs on parents, employers, in Washington State. So could you say a little bit more about how those numbers were derived?
Sure, and if anybody wants clear details on that, please reach out to me and I can put you in touch with our, because we did hire a couple of our economists out of Eastern Washington University to do the study. But basically we did a poll, we did a survey of parents across the state in different regions, and then utilizing BLS data as well as our state's employment data and unemployment data from the state. Using all of those data sets and the survey results, pinging that against that data is how they came to those two numbers. We worked with Georgia, the first state to do some of this. Georgia and Louisiana did a lot of this work before us. They were very helpful in sharing their survey as well as their methodology with us. So that's something that we're certainly happy to share with anybody who's willing or who's wondering and looking at doing this going forward. And I believe Julia as well, the U.S. Chamber, is looking at how do they expand some of these efforts too. So not being the PhD researcher, if you do want some of those details, please reach out to me and I'm happy to connect you with the folks who did the actual economic impact study.
Great, thank you. We had another question come in, and it says, Michelle said they've seen the benefit of childcare in their recruitment and retention numbers. I'd love to know more about how they measured that and if it's replicable for other employers.
Yeah, so great question. We have conducted some internal data benchmarks, but overall it's really been in the comments that we've received from our employees. We have a lot of different avenues for our employees to talk with us, both in ongoing leadership meetings as well as surveys that we conduct each year. And we just see overwhelming comments from employees that both have families and don't have families, stating that they're so proud to be able to know that that's being offered to their coworkers. Some of them might be grandparents, and they'll make comments on surveys such as, I wasn't able to use this, but I'm so happy that the person that I sit next to on the line can, because I know that they wouldn't be here. They're here more frequently now that we have consistent childcare that we're offering. And then, like I said, we have numbers on our attrition, watching the amount of folks that were not coming back to work, specifically mothers not coming back to work after having children, and that increased by over 30%. So we saw the attrition numbers decrease, and seeing us be able to retain those working mothers because they're able to come back to work, have on-site childcare, and be comfortable with where their children are at.
Great, thank you. Our next question says, how did AWB go about publicizing and sharing their survey to get feedback on the implications of childcare in the workforce? About how many respondents did they have?
So again, we contracted with Elway Reports, who did the survey. I believe we had 400 respondents on that. So working with, as far as doing the survey, working with Child Care Aware, who put it out to a lot of the parents that they're serving, as well as us sending it out through our modes of communication, and then Elway just through their general avenues that they normally reach out. They did find that the telephone surveys were not successful, as you can imagine, but a lot of their online efforts were more successful. And again, happy to connect anybody with them if they're thinking about doing some more, any of these studies. Going forward, we will be speaking to chambers of commerce and business associations across the state over the next 4 to 6 months as we release this report and talk about the outcomes in the effort to really increase business participation in this conversation.
Thank you. So another question came in, reads, you mentioned having various options available to businesses to address the child care needs. Are there states looking at tax credits for child care providers, or any other child care tax credits for families not able to access subsidies. There are a few states with a CTC, but curious to know if there are other credits being pursued. I'm not quite sure what a CTC is, it might be specific to your state, but I think the overall thrust here is, could you speak to whether you could talk about the tax credits and how that might be useful?
Yeah, this is Julia. I think the person was mentioning the child tax credit, which is a federal tax credit. I would say there are many states who are looking at options. Many state and local chambers are very comfortable in the advocacy space, and so I think tax credits are obviously a natural place for them to have conversations with their policymakers. Louisiana and Nebraska, as I'm sure many of you know, have several very excellent early ed focused tax credits, and the report that Amy is talking about, the economic impact report, actually it started in Louisiana, and the data from that report really led to a lot of the tax credits being passed, including the school readiness tax credit, which a lot of folks in the early ed space look to as an example. So I would say many state and local chambers are definitely interested in tax conversations. The only thing that makes it a little more complicated is that they obviously have a lot of tax priorities already. And so I think that's where these multi-sector coalitions and strong partnerships can help bring, early ed priorities to the top of policy agendas. And I think Amy and AWB are a great example of making early ed a priority. We've seen a similar example in Georgia, where the Metro Atlanta Chamber partnered really closely with GEARS, and they came out with same type of report that Amy's talking about, this economic analysis report. And they have had a strong partnership for a while now, but the data that they found in this report and what the cost was to the state really helped equip those two groups, the Metro Atlanta Chamber and GEARS, on their policy priorities so that they are aligned and then can go to the state legislature together. So I'm not saying the tax credits are the only option, but they are absolutely a space where state and local chambers are interested in engaging more.
Great, thanks. So a quick question, and it's followed up by an additional question. So one quick question is, can you tell us when the chamber messaging report will be available?
Yes, late October, early November, and we will, kind of depending on when stuff goes to print, but we will be offering a webinar. We'll be rolling it out across our partners. So we'll, ask CSFP to socialize it. We'll put it on all of our social channels, and we'll be hosting a webinar for early ed advocates to join and kind of talk about how do we use this messaging guide and what does this mean for how we adapt the messaging that we're saying and how we approach chamber leaders.
Great. Yeah, and yes, we will be happy to help publicize the report. The next question is,
Thank you.
My nonprofit, you're welcome. So the next question is, my nonprofit is hosting a business leadership forum on these issues in October. Are there any key questions or messages that you would recommend for the panel discussion that would most pique the ears of the business leaders in the room? And I think the question is taking into context that, perhaps the report may not be available in time for this business event. So are there key messages or questions that you'd recommend that they could weave into their discussion in their October meeting?
I'll give Amy and Michelle, sorry, go ahead.
No, I say using some of the data that's out there, the Georgia report, Washington State's report will be out by then, to show the economic impact, the dollar amount, the return, the what this is doing impacting business is a good conversation starter, and asking those businesses, do they have this issue? Are they seeing a loss in productivity, people missing work or leaving the workforce because of this issue? Is a good conversation starter to pique the interest, and then talking about the data of the return on investment of early childhood learning, pulling your questions from that information as well.
I would agree with all of that Amy just said, and I would also add a lot of times business leaders are feeling workforce challenges but aren't necessarily making the connection to childcare as the a piece to that puzzle. And so I think asking questions of business leaders in the community or major employers and saying, what kinds of challenges are you experiencing, and hearing them vocalize it, and then talking about how, maybe like Amy said, Michelle said, recruitment and retention has increased significantly since they offered on-site care, but maybe the business leaders haven't necessarily put two and two together. And so asking them to tell you what their workforce challenges are, and then drawing the connections between childcare challenges and breakdowns in care and the cost, access issues of care, and how that actually is a part of their workforce challenges that they already reiterated, might be a helpful way to begin that conversation.
Great,
and
thank
just
you.
to add,
Go ahead, please.
Sorry. So from a business perspective, I've sat in a lot of these conversations, and I think the things that stick out to me, businesses are just in general uneducated about this. So any form of education, all of the brain science education has always been extremely powerful anytime I've heard discussions on that. But then also breaking it down to groups and kind of talking about what does early education really impact if it's done well, and all of the other items that it can impact, and even just flip charting that in small groups can really, I think, bring some information to the forefront that people just don't think about on a day-to-day basis.
Great, thank you. So we have a strategy question. Someone asked, when you speak with local chambers across the state, do you include local early childhood leaders or early learning coalition members in your meetings?
Yes, we do. And we've also found at AWB, since we started to work in this area, that our child care providers have found value in becoming members of AWB, not only because of the child care issues that we're working on, but the fact that we also work on general business issues which are also impacting them. Generally, what we try to do in a lot of our presentations, and this is the local child care advocates and statewide child care advocates as well, are starting to include us in their conversations. It's not just presentations by one people, it's a panel, so that we have the diversity of perspectives from business, labor, and child care advocates too.
Great. And I think we have time for one more question, but if we're able to squeeze in another, I'll certainly do so. So the next question is, are businesses in Washington State receiving any kind of benefit for creating child care solutions for their employees?
Michelle's probably best to answer that one.
So not directly from the state. There are grants available, and there is some federal tax credits available to certain employer designations. But primarily, most corporate businesses are not receiving any kind of tax credit or incentive for having on-site childcare, other than in their own benefits that they're seeing in their own bottom line numbers.
And that's really a push for the task force that we have in place, is how do we incentivize businesses to participate in this, because they can't all do like what Schweitzer did and continues to do to support their businesses, but how do we really support our small to medium-sized businesses as well, because that's the majority of our business demographics in Washington State. In providing childcare, is it of a benefit? It's not a universal benefit like you find with healthcare. So how to support businesses in supporting their employees in this effort.
Great, thank you. So I see we're at time. There are a couple more questions in the queue, but we will just organize getting the questions to the speakers. And so we just make the same suggestion for you. If there's a question you have thought about even after the webinar and you'd like to connect with the presenters, just let us know. We'd be happy to make that connection for you. Otherwise, we'd like to thank all of you for participating, and certainly thank our presenters for sharing such great information with us. So thank you, and just as a reminder, the slides and the audio of this presentation will be available to you in about 2 days. So we're expecting on Tuesday you'll get a note with the information posted. So thank you again, and have a great afternoon and a lovely Labor Day weekend. Thank you. Bye-bye.